So I'm just going to look briefly at the invasives affecting Windermere. I'm going to be glossing over some of them because we don't have long enough tonight. So just a brief bit about what are invasive species. Invasive non-native species, you'll often see the acronym of INS. They are life forms that are found colonising not in their natural range, mainly brought about hugely by the Victorians, bringing about plants that were particularly pretty, and often these escaped from gardens, collections into the wild, or they did sometimes put things into the wild, such as the grey squirrels. So historically, they've not been found here. Nowadays, you might get them coming through via kind of containers from abroad, through trees coming in, through plants in garden centres. And they are often characterised, because we can have naturalised species, which the little owl, I love the little owl, is a naturalised species, wasn't native, now it is. So invasive species, they are causing damage to our native environment, which is why we want them gone. Water is a particularly excellent transport medium for the dispersal of many of these species, which is why it's really keen that we, as kind of South Cumbria Rivers Trust, Freshwater Biological Association, everyone living and moving alongside water kind of does their bit with invasive species. So this graph here, it's a bit gloomy. It covers from 1960 to 2020 and how invasive non-native species have increased in the UK. So you can find this report in the Non-Native Species Secretariat, which is a government organisation. So freshwater may look like it has least, which it does, but it's really important that we still look at those. But I've also included this to look at kind of how the stuff that I'm talking about today, you can apply it to the land, because it's good to stop all invasive non-native species from all of the catchment area, because it will negatively impact the water environment eventually. So the main causes for increase are climate change. As everything heats up, it becomes a lot more palatable for invasive non-native species. Our native species are quite delicate normally, and so those abrupt changes, they really can't cope with it. So, for example, when you've got species like Japanese knotweed, it's used to colonising volcanic areas in its native range. Himalayan balsam prefers it down here because it's warmer and therefore easier to spread. So invasive non-native species are used to much harder climates. So the more movement around the UK, many of us here will keep travelling around the UK to visit family, to visit friends, to go on holiday, to go travel for work. Some people travel an hour or more for work, crossing multiple catchments, boundaries and counties. So the more you move, the more you risk bringing in. As I mentioned before, it talks about the imports and the greater variety. So back on that graph, when we looked at kind of the inland invasive species, a lot of that is the fungi affecting all the trees around. And that will affect the ecology of the rivers, because a lot of the species like alder that goes along the riverbanks, that's affected by disease and can create destabilisation of the banks. And that will create sediment going into the water. There's a lot of garden plants escaping the garden. Unfortunately, I would say that a good chunk of these are from people who might think that they're all just vegetation and will degrade naturally if they just put them in a wood somewhere or on a verge somewhere. This doesn't happen with a large amount of the species. One of the newest ones is Mombretia, which is what you'll see around a lot of the banks. So the biggest issue is that they outcompete a lot of our plants. They are actual kind of natural causes, including flooding and high winds, animal dispersal. So these also play a factor into the spread. So one of the things that we are most proud about in Windermere Catchment, the Kent Catchment, South Cumbria in general, is our white-clawed crayfish that are native. They are particularly struggling because American signal crayfish come in and they outcompete them, kill them. They were brought in as part of the food industry and just released so that you can just fish them out yourself and eat them. They then brought about the crayfish plague, which we currently don't have in South Cumbria. However, it's very easy to bring it across. So knowledge is key. So if you know that we don't have it, and the fact that a single droplet from an infected area can bring it into our area, it really shows it's so important to dry your equipment before moving it across. So we do have the signal crayfish in Cumbria in small populations. These are gradually decreasing. At the moment in the Kent catchment, there aren't any signal crayfish. But in Windermere, there are a few small locations. It's important that if you think you've seen one, that you do just highlight it to the Environment Agency or to us or the FBA, because they can look very much like our white-clawed crayfish, and it's an offence if you kill a white-clawed crayfish. And it's an offence if you knowingly release a signal crayfish into the wild. So just take a photo, highlight it to someone along with the location. New Zealand pygmy weed. So this creates these dense mats across the area, smothering out vegetation, creating issues. If you are using it for swimming, you're not going to be able to kind of use those areas very much. We do have some small locations in the Windermere catchment with it, more in kind of pools and ponds outside of Windermere itself. But yet again, its knowledge is key. It's being able to identify these. And it also significantly alters the ecosystem ecology of the water body. So it changes kind of the way the nutrients are, the way kind of the invertebrates are amongst there, and kind of temperature, light conditions. Himalayan balsam is my main one. It's not in the river, I know, but its main issue is that it produces around 800 seeds a plant, and it outcompetes all of our native plants and goes all along the banks. If we don't get rid of it during the winter, it dies back because it's only an annual, and you're left with these great big muddy slopes, which then will go into the water, creating sediment offload, changing the nutrients, changing how the gravel bed underneath is, and therefore it's upsetting everything around. American skunk cabbage is another one that we're looking at. This one you will smell before you see it. It's not called skunk cabbage for nothing. Interestingly, it actually produces its own heat, which when we've been talking about climate change, we don't really want a plant that produces its own heat. It's, yet again, outcompetes local plants. It can grow quite big. And then the main way to deal with that is through contractors, so it gets a bit pricey. So tackling inns in Windermere. I'm going to apologise for the next slide. I didn't realise how big this the board is. So I've tipped Windermere on its side. So we've got north on the right over there. So the red dots represent Himalayan balsam in 2023. The brown dots represent from some earlier years. For about 10 years now, we've had a dedicated volunteer group that have been tackling Himalayan balsam. I will go back to the previous slide, I must admit, because as you can see on this slide, it's very obvious that we're working from the top down. It's really important that whenever we do anything with invasive species, and that you work from the top of the catchment, because otherwise it'll just reinfest. So one of the biggest problems that we have is the potential for swimmers, boat users, anyone kind of coming out of the catchment. You've got races like Swim Run Coniston, which goes from Coniston to Grasmere, which goes up the catchment. So anything that is in Coniston, that is at the bottom of Windermere, anywhere in between will get brought up. So it's important that, yet again, you have that biosecurity. Why be biosecure? This is my main message, really, is highlighting why it's great for you to have this knowledge. So zebra mussels, they are not in our catchment at the moment. They are in Lancashire. The issue behind these is that they remove nutrients from the water, they damage and block infrastructure, and they smother native species. If ever you've seen zebra mussels, they literally just pile up. They're not good, and they're not good for our native pearl mussels. Parrot's feather is in Lancashire and Yorkshire. Yet again, outcompetes native plants, and it will kind of create a bit of a blanket. And if you're a recreational user of the water, it will cover it, and it will give you less area and risk you getting tangled up in it. And one of the biggest ones is floating pennywort. That's in Lancashire and Yorkshire. The limit to the areas for recreation use exacerbates flooding and changes the ecology of the water body. And this picture is floating pennywort, which I think greatly shows why biosecurity, check, clean, dry, is so important, and actually catching it before it comes into Windermere. So it's not in Windermere. It has the great likelihood of ending up in it because people travel around with their kayaks, with their canoes, with their swimming gear, with their dogs. So on this picture, we actually have some killer shrimp, which they're not in Cumbria at all, thankfully. But it shows how if you're in waders, you can just pick up these killer shrimp. If you're in waders, you can pick up bits of floating pennywort, bits of New Zealand pygmyweed. You only need a very small amount to go without kind of being noticed and bringing it back into the catchment. So 3 simple things to do is check, clean, dry. You've heard it throughout all the presentations. Whack off any of the mud, the bits of shrimp, if you have any bits of vegetation, leave them where you found them. You can wash off if you've got any washing facilities nearby, hose down boats or anything like that. And then you dry it at home, or you can put it in the washing machine if it's swimming gear at 40 degrees with some normal detergent. That normally kills it off. Always check the kind of areas that you don't think to check. So inside the kayak, inside wheels. Remember where you're storing some of your stuff. So in the Windermere Catchment, there is somewhere where the boats are stored, and it's right where the balsam is, and it drags the balsam right into the river. That will go spread downwards, and the balsam is at yet another location, which we've got to find. So some of the biggest issues moving forward is actually that we struggle with money towards invasive species. They're not wonderful and brilliant. They're not we're putting back something back into the environment, that we're taking it out. So there's no positive outlook of it in some respects, because it's what you can take away. And a lot of the money would be needed for biosecurity things by putting kind of boot scrapes in, or washing kits, or signage, doing talks to people. That is not very appealing for funders. So one of the things that's happening at the moment is that we're working alongside other catchments across Cumbria, so it's becoming a Cumbria-wide thing where possible. Yet again, everyone's struggling for money, but we are trying to make it stick. One of the biggest citizen science things happening at the moment is that people are using like apps such as iNaturalist, and INSMapper is the newest one dedicated for invasive non-native species. So feel free to download it. That's the symbol for it on the top left. A huge thing that's really needed is the community. It's that setting the example when you're out there doing your swimming, doing your kayaking, paddleboarding. If you've got dogs who love going in, maybe they come out with loads of vegetation sticking out all over themselves. They can easily spread it. Is that actively kind of adding it to our records, because if you've not seen it and you don't tell us, I won't have seen it because you access more areas than I do. And actually actively helping in removal of invasive species. So if you know what it is and you come along and learn how to tackle it, some species like Himalayan balsam, it's one of the main ones that you can actually deal with easily enough, we can get rid of it. And we are almost rid of it in Grasmere and Rydal, and we're making our way down. So Ambleside is the next stop, and getting towards the top of Windermere village. So volunteering that we've got is, you're going to be sick of me hearing me say this, but Himalayan balsam removal. I think that it's very good to focus on a species, because if I stop kind of the work that all the volunteers have been doing for 10 years, then it won't be for anything, because if you leave that one plant, 800 seeds later, you've got it. There are future reed bed restoration happening in Windermere. If you email info@scrt, you'll be able to get more information on that. So that helps filter out the nutrients that are going into Windermere itself. And there's various surveys of riverfly, e-fishing, and yet again, using those INS Mapper apps.